It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nageswaran, who's the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, and Professor Raghuram Rajan, who is the Harold McGraw, the third Foundation Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and the Catherine Dusack Miller, Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. Without any further ado, I will turn the floor over to my colleague, Professor Raghuram Rajan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sumit, and thanks, Leland, for doing this. I have some inkling of your job. It's a tough one, and it's key to understanding what's going on in India and pushing it in the right direction. You offer the view of a philosopher and guide for the economy through your economic report every year. So let me start with the short term, the current conjuncture. How do you characterize the Indian economy at this point? What's going right, and what are things that you worry about?
Thanks, Raghu. First of all, happy to share the stage with you. And for those of you who are not aware, when Raghu said he has an inkling of what my job involves, some of you may remember that before he became the RBI governor, he served for a year as chief economic advisor. So he really has more than an inkling of what this job entails. But to come to your question, Raghu, a couple of months ago when the US administration imposed the second round of penal tariffs on India, it looked first of all, it was very unexpected, and therefore it came as a sort of a shock to not only policymakers but the public as well. And therefore, there was a lot of talk of GDP growth being closer to 6 rather than closer to 7, etc. That kind of conversation was pretty rife at that time. But now 2 months or 3 months later, rather, I would say it feels like that much more clearer that it hasn't had the kind of adverse impact we feared it would have. Now, the GST, goods and services tax reforms, were sort of very fortuitously timed, although they were in the making for about a year or so, if not longer. And I think the good monsoons and rural demand are helping, and not to leave out the direct tax relief that was given in the budget on February 1st. So, and then you sort of throw in the fact that inflation is such an unprecedentedly low level, particularly food inflation. You have a sort of a trifecta of positive impact on disposable incomes, direct tax, indirect tax, and low inflation otherwise. And then I can add the fact that energy prices have been well behaved in general, and the central bank has also been doing some both liquidity and regulatory actions. So sort of you throw in all this into the mix, I think we are looking at a growth rate of around 7% in real terms this year. And the momentum looks like at the moment will carry forward into 26, 27. So that's what and this is all coming on top of overall macroeconomic stability that has been a distinguishing feature of the Indian economy post-COVID. When fiscal deficit hit 9.2% at the union government level back in 2021, very few probably gave a chance to the government to bring it down to 4.5% of GDP in 5 years, as was promised at the time. But we are there. I think this year we will be able to meet the 4.4% number. And that has contributed in a big way. And I think that's kind of underappreciated because 10 years ago, the 10-year borrowing cost for Government of India was 9.5%. Now it is 6.5%. So all these things are making me feel in the short run relatively sanguine. If you look at the macroeconomic dashboard or the health card, I think most parameters that we would normally look at, they are not even flashing amber at the moment. But that is not to trivialize the medium-term challenges, but I'm talking in the short run.
Absolutely. So macroeconomically speaking, things have gone reasonably well. The high level of fiscal discipline after the pandemic. The fact that inflation now is really nothing to speak of, right? It's well and truly in the in the target zone, perhaps even on the lower side.
I mean, current numbers are like Japanese numbers. It's 0.25%. The headline CPI inflation rate for the month of October, year on year.
Right.
So that sounds more like a
but
deflation term. But that's something.
There's a related sort of problem from having too low inflation, which is your nominal GDP growth doesn't grow as much, and then your tax revenues don't grow as much. So
correct. I think so.
Concern.
That is, hopefully that's a transient phenomena, because some of it comes through the global commodity prices being on the lower side, and hopefully, let's say next year, we will be able to hit double-digit nominal GDP. But I agree with you that there is a downside to that. Yeah.
So let me just clarify one thing, and then you mentioned GST reform. Not everybody here is fully cognizant of what happened in the GST reform.
First of all, we started out with 4 different goods and services tax rates back in 2017. The top rate was 28%. I mean, if you include 0, it becomes 5 as well. So now they were dropped to 2, 5 and 18. And there is a sort of a higher rate of 40%, but that's for very few handful of items, mostly sin goods as they call it. And bulk of those items which were earlier attracting 28%, they have moved to 12, and those who were at 18 have moved to 5, etc. So we have really not only the number of slabs have been eliminated, but most of the goods have moved into the lower rate category as well. So that is the.
And what's your sense on the effect on tax revenues? Is it
That's right.
largely neutral?
In fact, if you fall back on the last 8 years of GST history, what we have noticed is that every time the GST rates were lower, and they have been coming down, the revenue impact has been surprisingly positive. So it's been always, every time the rates were dropped, then there would be a static analysis telling us the monthly collections would be lower going forward, but actual numbers have turned out to be far better because there have been greater consumption. So in some sense, the so-called Laffer curve is played out on the indirect taxes side.
Right. Is this greater production and consumption as you indicated, or is it greater compliance, or
I think
compliance is minimal?
It's difficult for me to sort of isolate the effect of the two, and I think both have played their part as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's get to the. You mentioned tariffs were a unpleasant surprise.
Mm-hmm.
So one, what is the state of play on the tariff discussion as far as we are allowed to talk about it? And the second is before India started purchasing Russian oil in 2022, it was about 2% of our total oil consumption, as I understand it, and now it has increased to a substantial amount. If it is such a big, so what is the issue with Russian oil? Does India still need to use it? Can it dial back? What effect does that have on global commodity prices, etc.?
Sort of a layered question. So when we started increasing our purchase of Russian oil, we should also remember that many other earlier sources of crude were also no longer available, whether it's Venezuelan crude or Iranian crude, etc. And then we were also told, as has been made clear by many of my colleagues in the government, that you need to do this, otherwise oil prices will rise globally, and that will have implications for our economy. There was global economy that was coming out of 2 years of inflation shock from 2022.
When you say told by the US?
Sorry, yeah. So that was also part of the reason, and I think now what we are seeing is there is some sort of a rebalancing that's happening naturally. But we should also remember that unlike in the case of Iranian, Venezuelan crude, Russian crude oil per se is not sanctioned. So purchasing Russian crude oil isn't a sanctions violating action. So only a couple of companies have been sanctioned now lately. So in that sense, purchasing Russian crude is a legitimate activity, but in terms of international sanctions law. But obviously, to the extent that getting them across to India has been made more and more difficult through multiple levels of sanctions on shipping, on oil companies, etc. It's become more and more difficult as well. But now what would it do to the global oil price if India were to rebalance as it is doing? I don't think it is going to have a significant impact, because after 6 to 8 months of consecutive monthly production increases by OPEC countries, I think we are flush with supplies. So I don't think it will make a big difference if India were to rebalance, and I think that's happening. That's beginning to happen.
So India is cutting back.
Yes, I mean, I could see that from the data, that there is sort of a rebalancing that's happening. Yeah.
What about trade? The tariffs, and how are those discussions going?
Well, I mean, look, I don't have a crystal ball, and the last several months there have been many occasions in which we thought we were close to striking a deal with this administration, but they have turned out to be elusive. So it's difficult for me to sort of give you a timeline on it at this point. And I think it's kind of reasonably clear that it isn't anymore about specific tariff lines or tariff issues. It's really more geopolitical in nature rather than a trade-related areas of disagreement that still remain to be ironed out. So I don't think so. That's why that's becoming more difficult to predict. The timing is becoming more difficult. If it were only a trade-related issue, then it can be ironed out through a couple of rounds of conversations. That doesn't seem to be the case.
So in your sense, there is no stumbling block on the trade side?
As far as I know, as far as I understand from my colleagues in the system, there isn't one.
Okay. Yeah. So, let's turn a little bit to the medium-term issues. Then we'll turn to the really long-term issues. One of the big concerns in the data is the still tepid corporate investment. There are investment announcements, and they keep coming, but the realization of those investments tends to be a little delayed. And so far, we haven't seen the evidence on the ground that it's stepping up. Or maybe you have. What's your sense of corporate investment?
There I would like to sort of say that what happened in 2023-24 has stuck in people's minds that the corporate sector has not been investing. But if you really look at the data, post-COVID, the following year, 2021-22, were actually a natural sort of bounce back from a very low level. So that was a good year for corporate investment. 22-23 was pretty all right. It was 23-24 that turned out to be a disappointment in terms of the private sector capital formation, and that kind of sort of left an impression, deeper impression than it should have. And but actually, if you look at 24-25 data based on bottom-up corporate annual reports, as of now, the indication seems to be that they really stepped up to the plate in the last financial year. And the numbers are pretty good, at least based on some 1,700 companies which have already filed their annual reports. It's about 12.1 trillion rupees, far higher than the government's own capex of 10.5 trillion rupees, capital expenditure of 10.5 trillion rupees. So it was a pretty good number. And this year, despite the uncertainties we face, the trend seems to be pretty good. Now, putting all these together, we are at gross fixed capital formation rate of around 31-32% of GDP, which I think, under the circumstances, I think that's all right. I mean, to expect that India would be able to go to 35 to 37% as we experienced between 03 and 08, I don't think that's realistic in this world, and it probably may even be unnecessary.
It may have been excessive then.
Then exactly.
Yeah.
Therefore, I feel that we are doing pretty all right between public and private sector in terms of capital formation.
Now, one of the things you will see in India when you go there is the extremely high level of public investment that seems to be, because that's visible. And in every big city, you'll see a metro coming up. When is this excessive?
It'll take a long time for us to say it'll be excessive, because given the fact that you are at $2,700 per capita and you have these needs, I really think that's probably not one of those things that keep me up at night at this point.
So then public investment coupled with sort of the allied private investment, especially in construction, could take Indian growth a long way.
I think so. I do think for the next decade or so that I wouldn't worry about the excess investment part for now. Yeah.
So one of your economic surveys, I think your 2024 economic survey, made a very, very important case for less is more. Less government intervention, more let the private sector run, something which would be sort of very welcome in these, which is very welcome in these halls. One of the consequences, as I understand, was a committee was set up to make doing business easier in India. What's the status of that? How's it going?
So actually, the precursor to what I wrote in the economic survey, which was published in January 2025, although I did touch upon it 2024 July after the elections, but I took it up as a bigger piece in this year's economic survey. But before even the committee was appointed just barely a few months ago to look at what's happening in the union government on regulations, but somewhat quietly, in February itself, we began an exercise to do this with respect to states. And that, I can tell you, has been, touch wood, has been a pretty decent success. There is good appetite. And we gave them a list of 24 areas, not that they were very deep deregulation efforts, but it's more to whet the appetite. And we will be presenting sort of a dashboard of how many states did how much. Yeah. And the dashboard looks more green than blank in terms of the states completing the exercises. And more recently, even some of the relatively taboo areas such as land use conversion, Andhra Pradesh government has made it pretty much automatic in many places. That's huge. And then just last night or the day before, I think the Uttar Pradesh government has done a lot to liberalize working conditions and the third shift for women, and removing the artificial legal restrictions on some areas being considered too hazardous or risky for women to work, etc. The UP government has very comprehensively liberalized it. That came up last night or the night before. So I think states are doing it with far more enthusiasm than we anticipated. So that's a bigger story. With the union government, it is still in work in progress, although the ease of doing business deregulations have been happening since the first term of the Modi government in 2014. But I think there is a understanding now that it needs to sort of go deeper. Yeah. And I hope that currently whatever exercises that are currently underway, when the recommendations are given, I hope the ministries will take them up, as well as state governments have been doing.
I mean, one of the worries of the trying to tackle the doing business was the World Bank had a specific set of indicators, and then people sort of focused on those specific indicators. It was gaming the system, and it wasn't clear that just fixing those indicators would fix the problem.
Fair enough. But I mean, I think given where we were, starting anywhere would have been still welcome. So
at least the message that we need to reduce the red tape was important. But I think this idea of getting best practices in states to be shared and to be taken forward.
That is happening now, and I think that's a good thing. In fact, I'm trying to reframe this entire ease of doing business as sort of ease of being honest. Because, what our rules, regulations, and compliance have done in the last 75, 78 years since independence have been to make it costlier for Indian public and businesses to be honest. Yeah. And why that reframing is necessary in my view is that the moment you sort of make it easier to be honest, then you build trust, and trust leads to scale and scalability. I think, I sort of now started calling it more about ease of being honest than ease of doing business.
I think that makes sense. Yeah. Sometimes the real problem is you don't know what the regulation is. There are so many regulations at different times. Some have been repealed, some have not. In the RBI, we had this rule that you had to put everything into a master document. Yeah, I think that is something. And what was not in the master document was not a regulation.
No, I think what RBI did is it's a very good template for the governments to adopt or embrace. Yeah.
And you could do it on, how do you open a restaurant? Here are the things you got to do. Yeah. Here are the 10, 15. And then you'll see how onerous some of it is so that you can actually eliminate.
Exactly.
Turning to foreign direct investment, that too has been an area where India wants more. Even with the China plus one story, it's sort of perhaps less than we desire. What's the constraint?
Yeah, the picture is slightly more mixed than what headline numbers looking at net FDI would indicate. Because first of all, gross numbers have held up by and large, which is basically a combination of inflows and retained profits of the multinationals. But what happened in the last 2-3 years is that the net FDI numbers were lower, and they were trending lower as well. And that has got a lot to do with the fact that the public markets in India were performing extremely well, and there were a lot of profits to take. I mean, for example, I'll just give you one figure. Hyundai India's IPO, the market cap of the Indian subsidiary itself on listing was 45% of the market cap of the parent company. So why would any investor leave that kind of money on the table? And therefore, there was a lot of encashing and change of ownership of hands from private foreign investors to Indian institutional investors, whether they are overseas or Indian. So basically, that kind of made the net numbers look a lot weaker than they were. But in terms of sentiments, there wasn't any waning of sentiment as far as I could see in conversations or in surveys of looking at India as an investment destination. But luckily, I feel that even this negative trend in net FDI probably reached its floor last year, because if you look at RBI's data for the first 5 months of the current financial year, the net FDI numbers are looking a lot healthier than they did in the previous 2 years. So I hope that we found a floor last year.
So you're sort of saying one of the strengths of the recent years, which has been the greater involvement of the Indian population in the equity markets.
That's right.
Which earlier was dominated by foreign investors.
Yeah, that is one of the reasons why I think, although in the last 1 year, the Indian public markets have kind of underperformed, but it hasn't really cratered. Right. And despite the fact that there's been a significant net outflow of foreign institutional money, and that's largely because of the sort of offsetting inflows from domestic, both retail and institutional.
And which in the longer run, equity market's a big source of returns for the domestic population.
It's a good thing. Yeah.
And that's a good thing. So what can you tell us about the China plus one story in India? Is it alive?
Oh, it's still very much alive. In fact, now I think it's obviously everybody talks about the success story of smartphone manufacturing moving, but I think it's also happening in a few other areas in terms of toys. And although it may not look still big enough or significant enough on APIs for pharma, there is some sort of a clawing back of market share that's happening. But more importantly, I think it is regardless of the governments driving them now. I think in our conversations despite the tariffs, when we try to meet US companies located in India and talk to even European ones, the China plus one has a larger or a longer time frame than how we are used to measuring the success. So I think it is a process, and from my conversations tell me that it will continue.
What can you tell us about, say, the state of Apple's sort of investments in India? Have they upgraded the technology?
I think
Are they moving up?
Yeah, sorry. What's happening is that I think the value addition in the Indian manufactured phones is increasing. It was single digits in the first few years. Now it is in high double digits. And some more components are now being made inside the country. And two huge, by Indian standards, huge factories, one near Bangalore airport and one in Sri Perumbudur near Chennai, capable of housing 100,000 workers, is being put up by Apple, one in Chennai and one near Bangalore. So I think that is one story.
Just for Apple work?
Just for Apple, yeah. Just Apple. So that story is, touchwood, is making progress and growing in size as well. Of course, we have the situation where the fentanyl tariff on China has been dropped from 20 to 10. And if it goes from 10 to 0, then in a way that becomes a good structural driver for India to look at more of the inverted duty structures, because the fentanyl tariff did give a certain competitive cushion, and that's now halved. It can go to 0. Then I think even the smartphones will become relatively costlier. So that is an area of urgent attention. So we can't assume that the 10% will remain.
Right.
So that's, in a way, it's a good thing. Yeah.
There was some talk earlier that India was hostile to Chinese investment and that Chinese engineers were finding it hard to get visas to come to India. More recently, it's flipped the other way, that India is favorable to Chinese investment, but the Chinese aren't allowing their engineers to come to India because they don't want to be displaced. What's the reality here?
No, I think it's probably still the case of both sides feeling their way around the problem and not having enough trust to make that a better story than what it is. I think the visa situation is somewhat better. But I think China is also, from some of the reading that you get from the Ministry of External Affairs, in India, they translate Chinese language newspapers and send us what the commentary there in India about India. It's very interesting. I think they feel that we shouldn't do to India what the West allowed us to do, sort of to grow at their expense. So we shouldn't be repeating the same mistake, is the kind of commentary that I read in Chinese newspapers, which are sent to us by the ministry, translated versions. So I think they are not going to send us the investments that we think are absolutely critical to us. They may do so in non-critical areas. So how far that would be happening? So we would rather look at some of the foreign manufacturers located in China and exporting to the world and exporting to India from there, and attract them to relocate to India and use India as the base. I think that's a far more fruitful avenue than to attract Chinese manufacturers from China, which is going to be more difficult.
Right. So two concerns foreign firms sometimes say about investing in India, apart from the red tape which we talked about, is the one, the uncertainty about taxes, and the second, the uncertainty about regulations, especially when they're competing against big Indian houses. What's your sense of both those?
No, I think again, as we have to sort of distinguish between the stock and the flow. As stock, I think both issues are relevant, but as a flow issue, I think both are becoming better. In terms of taxes, I think the key issues we hear whenever we speak to the foreign investors are two or three things. One is advanced pricing agreements, and then the safe harbor limits and transfer pricing rules, and of course stability of the policy. So that is a lot of there is a lot of merit or truth to attending to those issues. And it's also the interpretation at the field level. So if the laws are not drafted well, then it gives a huge scope for different interpretation depending on the jurisdiction. So I think that is an area and that needs to be attended to. I think in terms of where there is a sort of a domestic versus foreign favoritism, etc., I don't think it is particularly sensitive or unique to India than it is for many other countries. I think it's an issue that all countries are grappling with in a fragmented situation. So I'm not sure that it is a binding constraint.
Okay. Let me go now to the long term. We sort of flirted with it, but I mean the biggest issue that seems to be discussed in elections or debated is jobs. Where are the jobs going to come from?
So currently, I think the job creation machinery is working well, but it is the income generation that is more of a challenge. I think if I look at the numbers last couple of years, whether it is the data that Saurabh's Ministry of Statistics puts out or private sector estimates, we have good numbers on job creation. It is the income growth, particularly in urban India, that has been lagging, and that's partly because of what's happening to information technology hiring, related hiring, and this new phenomenon of gig workers. And there's also a lot of voluntary unemployment, and that's partly to do with the fact that states also have been doing a lot of transfer payments lately, so that does distort the incentives. So where are the jobs going to come from? My particular view is that we do have a huge hole in the middle in terms of the Mittelstand. We don't have them. And that is where we need to focus on. And that is why I'm so invested in this deregulation bit. If we are going to make the cost of doing business for small and medium enterprises much more much affordable, that is where I think we will be able to create the jobs, and that's what history tells us. Economic history tells us, and we haven't. At some level, I can say perversely, it's a good news that we haven't even scratched the surface in that sense. So there is still a lot of low-hanging or mid-hanging fruits that are out there in that space.
I mean, one of the places where we have created jobs is really in moderate quality urban services, right?
Okay.
That's where a lot of the job creation, that's been the expanding part. And that has tapered off a little right now, but we need to do more. I think we're going to hear about skilling this afternoon, especially the Orissa success.
Yeah.
But the government announced a few skilling programs. What's the story on those, and do we need more? Do we need?
To be honest, I think there is also a demand side issue here, and that is partly to do with attitudes and also lack of information. And you're right. I think we need to. Many states or even the union government have to learn from what Subrato did in the state of Odisha. So skilling initiatives are underway, and there is a lot of cash incentives given to people, but much of skilling happens on the job, and that is where I think the Apprenticeship Act has been amended a couple of times for the better, but still it is somewhat restrictive in nature. We can do better there. And also there is information asymmetry because, and I believe again Nandan Nilekani's 8-Step Foundation has come up with a new initiative called Blue Dot, which using GPS and AI are trying to connect job seekers or skill seekers with small and medium enterprises within 20 to 30 kilometer radius. Apparently in one particular street, there is an educational institution at one end and there's a small enterprise at the other end of the street. Both of them didn't know that they existed. And this initiative has actually enabled quite a bit of those college graduates to find jobs in this enterprise at the other side of the street. So this kind of information asymmetry, and I believe now I spoke to Labour Secretary before coming, and she said we are aware of it and we are piloting it in more places than one at the moment. So these kinds of micro initiatives also will have to happen.
I mean, you're talking electronic labor exchanges.
In a way,
and that seems like a no-brainer given
decentralized,
decentralized, and let's not let the labor ministry take it over. Let it be something that is in the private sector, and you may expect more results in the near term. You can't talk about jobs without talking about female labor force participation. Now, of course, the numbers look better now, but there is some debate about what those numbers actually mean. What's your sense of where that is, and what's the truth, what's the reality?
Sure. I think multiple forces are at work. First of all, female labor force participation rates across the world aren't comparable. Definitions vary from country to country. And in the case of India, of course, much of value addition by women happen, but they are not counted because they are not paid for. So in that sense, much of the work that happens in other countries, particularly in developed ones for child care or elder care or other things, happen as unpaid work in the Indian context. So there is a natural, for cultural reasons, understatement of female labor force participation in the Indian context. The second thing is post-COVID, I think during COVID, many of the women in urban India quit their jobs because Indian states had extended school closures. And therefore, they had to leave their jobs to look after children who were staying at home and elders as well. And many of them haven't gone back because this phenomena of urban company and all these new gig working opportunities give them the flexibility to choose when they accept assignments and when they don't. So it isn't particular. And of course, what I mentioned earlier in the context of Uttar Pradesh, I looked at the state level constraints. Across the Indian states, there were close to about 200 restrictions on areas where women were not allowed to work because they were deemed unsafe by the state. Now, in an era when women are now in combat zones in the Indian military, etc., Indian states maintaining in their statute books prohibition of occupation in 200 areas was a major dampener, and that is also getting now addressed, and UP was an example. So I think it's a combination of these things that would see the female labor force participation pick up.
Yeah. I mean, one interesting trait, and maybe Suhani knows more about this and we'll hear about it, is, with education, actually, labor force participation doesn't necessarily increase. It's sort of more flattish. So,
and also, I wonder whether some of it is also, we have to account for cultural differences.
That may well be part of the
explanation,
the answer and the need of the hour. So let's go to ambition and aspiration. The Prime Minister wants the country to be a developed country by 2047. We saw a number today that means a 30 trillion economy. If we say it's a 7 trillion economy and we're talking real dollars as opposed to inflated dollars, are we talking real or in?
No, I mean, so we're talking about $20-25.
Okay, if we're talking $20-25, the ambassador said 7 trillion by 2030, which is about 5 years. From four and a quarter to 7, given a reasonable rate of growth. But then from 7 to 30 is a 4.25 times increase over 17 years. That's in the growth rates of 8 and 9%.
So, Raghu, I think when Saurabh was speaking and Vinay was speaking, I was doing the math on my Excel spreadsheets. Yeah. So, according to the fund's World Economic Outlook from last month, we're supposed to be 6.6 trillion by March 2031. So, according to their projections. So, we were 3.
That I'm not, I take that as granted.
Yeah, so that's 3.9 end of March last year.
Yeah.
So, if you are to look at the figure of 30.2 which Saurabh presented, if this has to be reached by March or whatever, 2047, you look at 9.7% compounded growth rate in dollar terms. And if I stretch it to March 48, it becomes 9.3. Yeah. And if I take it to March 50, then it's a doable 8.5. Why I say doable is because last 30 years we came from 300 billion to 3.9 trillion, and that was 8.6%. And that is after accounting for about roughly 3% annual rupee depreciation against the dollar.
Yeah.
Now, if real rates in developed world have to remain negative to take care of their huge debt, and there is financial repression and currency weakness, of course, it brings with it its own challenges for us in terms of export competitiveness, etc. But if that is the case, then the 8.6% historical growth rate may not necessarily be that difficult to replicate. That's one way of looking at it.
That's one way, but remember, we're getting richer and richer.
Absolutely.
So the growth rate
it can't continue the same pace. Yeah. I agree with you. And I will also give you one more explanation why that may not necessarily be transferable to the next 30 years. I mean, at some level, I think geopolitical environment was far more stable in the last 30. The next 30 is going to be extremely unpredictable. And if you have, heavens forbid, if you have another global conflagration, then all your bets are off. So it's not going to be that easy. But I think at the end of the day, we have to own up the effort.
Yeah.
The outcomes will take care of themselves.
But then one of the participants here was asking me the question, which he said he'll bring up later also, but you need to invest hugely in human capital.
Agree.
For this to happen. Where is that investment happening?
So, see, 20 years ago, we were very concerned about enrollment issues in schools, in secondary, higher secondary, and tertiary. But now, 20 years later, we have cracked the enrollment puzzle. I think enrollments are no longer an issue. It is actually growing in rural India even faster than in urban India, and women more than men. So that data gives us that kind of assurance. And even in tertiary education, although we are still nowhere near developed countries, compared to at the beginning of the millennium when we were about 6% gross enrollment ratio, in tertiary education now it is about 30%.
It's more than the UK at this point.
Yeah, so that's, of course, I think that's one part. In fact, I would even say we need to do a lot more on vocational and technical education. That is where I think what Subrata Bagchi did in Odisha is a huge role model for other states to emulate. But the real concern I have with human capital is because somehow education and skilling are relatively more tractable problems compared to what I would say as taking care of their emotional, physical, and mental health in a world of smartphones, screen time, and social media. I think that is my bigger concern than education and skilling.
But some of that is also a result of the education and skilling not being of the right quality, right? I mean, we have a tremendous number of colleges, but only a fraction of them are good quality.
No, I wouldn't attribute causality to that, because that's a problem that's prevailing in every country, even here. This emotional mental health, I mean, Jonathan Haidt wrote about it in terms of the anxious generation in this country from 2010 onwards. So it has nothing to do with that.
You want them to get off WhatsApp and actually
absolutely.
focus
I mean, many countries are beginning to ban social media apps until the age of 16. And in fact, in India, in the Indian context, and you are associated with Kriya University as well, Sapien Labs located there, did a study based on Delhi and Tamil Nadu student 100,000 sample. The earlier a child is exposed to smartphones, the more difficult it is for that child to finish undergraduate education. So the later you are introduced to smartphones, the higher are your chances of graduating with a degree from college. So it is very clear, mental health quotient, all these things are related to. So it's about going back to, quote unquote, the roots in terms of physical activity, connecting in your local language, and eating not so ultra processed foods and less screen time. These are more important for realizing the human capital potential in India than education and skilling. I'm confident that we will crack the education and skilling somehow, because they are more tangible public policy challenges. These are more subterranean.
So let me turn lastly to R&D, right? I mean, that's huge for India's not just growth, but also its defense, security, etc. Are we doing enough? Should we be doing more?
So I'll start with first a factual clarification, and then I'll address the substantive part of your question. First of all, India's oft-stated public data that we only do 0.6 or 0.7% as R&D, and that two-thirds are coming from the public sector, is to some extent understated, because much of the data for that comes from listed companies. And today, unlisted companies are doing much more work, and it's not counted. So there is one data issue there, but I'm not therefore saying that the problem doesn't exist. It is a problem, but just I wanted to get this out of the way. But in terms of what we are doing about it, so the government this year has activated two funds. One is to do the TRL, Technology Readiness Level 0 to 5, a basic technology fund, Anusandhan National Research Fund, ANRF, and the one is called Research and Development Initiative Fund, RDIF, and that's more for commercialization, TRL 5 to 9. So the government has seeded both these funds, but the private sector also has to play its part, and to some extent there I feel that the established corporate sector, barring a few exceptions, we did a good job when the TRIPS agreement happened in 1995 in Paris, and then the Indian pharma companies faced an existential crisis, and they doubled or trebled their R&D expenditure, and they survived that TRIPS agreement. I think we need sort of a repeat of that in multiple sectors, and I don't see the signs of that yet. Even in these two funds, I feel the private sector isn't coming forward with enthusiasm to put in their share of resources, identifying areas, participating in the governance structure. I think that there is a mindset issue here, and I think recently what we considered as a big success in India compared to, let's say, China or other country where we had a much more evolved capital market than elsewhere. I think sometimes we wonder whether the focus on quarterly earnings and stock prices have kind of undermined the long-term competitiveness perspectives in the corporate sector. That's one issue to consider. There's a behavioral dimension here as well.
Well, you brought up the issue of competition. I mean, one of the things the Chinese seem to do very well is get their companies to compete.
Domestic competition.
Domestic competition.
Yeah.
And then everyone is struggling for market share within the country.
Yeah.
And then, do you think we have too little competition in India?
Depends on the sector, I suppose. But I think in many of the new sectors, there is no dearth of competition. But I mean, you can look at aviation or passenger, civil commercial aviation or the telecom sectors, we can do with competition.
We can do with more competition.
Yeah.
Okay, on that wonderful note, we have a lot more. I have a lot more filler questions, but I thought important to open up to the audience and have people ask questions. Just say who you are and feel free to ask any and all questions.
Fantastic conversation. I'm Stephen Kotkin, a fellow here. Talk about in the growth that you're dealing with, the underpinnings of the growth. So the domestic market and overcoming some of the free trade obstacles within India, for example. Energy supply and the proportion of various different possibilities inside energy supply. In other words, growth is importantly about investment in people and investment in new technology, but also there are these underpinnings where India has made some significant progress, obviously. And how do you see that going forward?
In terms of going forward, in which area are you talking about?
Domestic market, overcoming obstacles in the domestic market, and the energy supply ramping up, which would be not detrimental energy supply, but positive sum energy supply.
Sure. No, I think in terms of the domestic single market, the goods and services tax introduction has played a very big role in creating a national single market. And if anything, the recent simplification or rationalization, as we call it, has probably further hastened that. So
by eliminating taxes at every state border.
As you cross state borders. And then, of course, the massive augmentation of physical infrastructure has also done that. And then in digital space, we have a huge national market. Given the fact that most of the orders are now placed in India through electronic commerce, and goods are delivered from across state borders. So in some sense, I think we have progressed quite a bit with respect to having these efficiencies arising out of a national single market. Now, when it comes to energy provision, and again, let's say probably a decade or so earlier, we used to still talk about load shedding and power shutdowns, etc. Today, the average power availability in urban India is close to 24 hours, and rural India is close to about 22 hours a day. So that is definitely a huge improvement. But nonetheless, there is a competitiveness issue in terms of energy costs for industry versus energy costs for urban consumers, residential consumers. I think we are actually charging more for manufacturing enterprises, and that is a competitiveness issue. And that is where further augmenting energy supplies, we have done better than what we committed in the nationally determined contribution. Said we committed that 50% of our installed capacity will come from renewable energy sources by 2030, and we achieved it by 2025, beginning of this year. So we are 5 years ahead of time on that. But I think to some extent, we also then announced in the budget that we will open up nuclear energy for the private sector. And we will amend the Civil Nuclear Liability Act, which has been there, which has deterred foreign investment. Both are hopefully going to see the light of the day by the end of the winter session of Parliament by December. So we are thinking about diversifying our sources of energy supply from coal to not only non-renewable sources, but non-fossil fuels more broadly, hydro, nuclear, and also trying to create storage. Now, most of the renewable energy generation projects have to come packaged with storage feasibility studies as well, so pump storage or batteries. So there is some thinking that is going on in creating a national energy plan, which I think the Power Ministry is working on. But some of the issues that Professor Dubash's presentation brought out in terms of having a national approach, coordinated approach, etc., and also looking at the distributional inefficiencies at the state level, and in terms of preparing the grid, considering what happened in Spain on April 28th, and considering what is going on in the Netherlands at the moment, where there is a problem of excess supply and feast and famine because of renewable energy fee situation, I think we need to have a much better sense of these additional investment requirements that will be needed in this sector. So purely from the point of view of capacity additions, we have done very well, but these things are still lying in the future, and we need to work on them. Yeah.
About a year or so ago, on a call with the editor of Foreign Policy, when Raghu was talking about Indian economic policy, on that conversation, I raised the issue of growing inequality in India. At the time, Raghu explained to me why, for the moment, he was not overly concerned. I won't put him on the spot again, but instead I'll turn to you and ask you if you consider this to be a concern from your particular perch.
Oh, on that matter, I'm very happy to defer to the wisdom of my predecessor from 2012-13. No, I agree with him. See, the thing is, in terms of, if you look at it, even in this country, if you look at the Congressional Budget Office's data where they give you household income distribution before transfers and taxes and after transfers and taxes, there's a huge difference. And the same thing works in India as well. After you take into account transfers and taxes, the situation is far better than what it looks pre-transfers and taxes. And in terms of consumption inequality, it is definitely much lower, given the fact that many of the supplies of food, which still constitutes a large portion of monthly consumption basket, they are now given relatively free. So, if you look at it in both these, if you look at both these parameters, therefore the issue becomes a lot less worrisome than what you would think about prima facie. I would think, therefore, we in the government have to continue to work on making equality of opportunities rather than worrying about the outcomes, which is a combination of both global and also personal attributes, skill and willingness to work, and many things come into the picture. So from the point of view of social stability or economic growth prospects, etc., right now I would suspect that inequality is not a situation where it has gone to a level where it is economically counterproductive.
Thank you. So I want to talk about the financial sector, banking sector, with Raghu being there. That did not come up in the discussion, so I have to bring it up. We invested a whole lot in India in the last 10, 15 years, cleaning up the banking sector. And one of the promises was that you'll have an uptick in, as a result of that, private sector investment. So there was this discussion that we earlier had, that the gross capital formation has been low. And did I get it right that you think that that's sort of the level that we are comfortable with? In the short term, I can see that. But if we want to grow at 8.5%, 9.5%, eventually that has to tick up. So where I'm headed with that A, is the benefit of all that banking sector reform that we're thinking about, we are yet to see that, or we feel like, yeah, we got the benefit, we reap the benefit of all the consolidation and so on, and it's just that you're not seeing that in the private gross capital formation. Maybe it's showing up at some other place.
I'm not sure that is the reason why private sector capital formation is not growing. First of all, as I said, considering the level of uncertainties that we have in the world, I am not uncomfortable with the current levels of capital formation in the economy. Now, it's easy for us to say, based on past patterns in other countries or even in India in 20 years ago, that we should be investing at the rate of 35 to 40% and applying some I-COR ratio and get 8 to 9%. I think that kind of ignores the context, the global context. Now, banks, Indian corporate sector in the last 4 or 5 years post-COVID has achieved tremendous profitability, and that's one of the reasons why they didn't need bank financing. Profitability was at a 15-year high in March 2024. So if you look at the data, there is so much of retained earnings in the Indian corporate sector. Second point is the capital market has grown and the options have become so wider that if you look at RBI's the table that they put out, table 63 in their handbook of statistics on the Indian economy, where they look at the overall funds resource availability to the commercial sector, excluding government basically, the growth rate of resources that have been made available to the commercial sector, both from foreign and domestic sources, has grown at a rate of 28.5% in the last 6 years, annual rate. Even if the bank credit growth has been relatively muted. So there isn't a question of shortage of funds holding back the capital formation in the Indian corporate sector. And what I clarified to Raghu also was that the capital formation per se hasn't done badly. So I don't see funding as a constraint. We can look at whether the Indian banking system, as it is structured currently, is capable of driving the kind of economic aspirations that we have, and that's a legitimate discussion to have. But that's a separate issue.
Back there.
Hello, Emily Tallow. I'm the India-US postdoc at the Center for International Security and Cooperation across the street. My question is, it might be a little bit out of the economic wheelhouse, but I was struck by the comment that India did not see the tariffs from the U.S. coming that you made at the beginning of the talk, and I wanted to ask about how India is actually seeing the U.S. in its as the role for the U.S. in its economic growth going forward, and whether the tariffs have recalibrated that relationship and the trustworthiness of the United States.
I'll have to duck that question because I'll have to defer to my diplomatic colleagues, either the Indian Consul General or the ambassador who spoke, as to how we see this playing out. I don't think it has come in the way of collaboration in other areas. Even government-to-government collaboration in defense has continued even in spite of the ongoing tariff standoff. And the strength of the diaspora and the collaboration in space or other areas, they are continuing. And I don't see this as a sort of more of a longer lasting phenomena, the current standoff. So I do believe that the relationship will endure and will expand in multiple areas, notwithstanding the situation that we find ourselves in. That's my personal take.
Thank you very much. My question is about production-linked incentives.
We went to Dinsha.
Dinsha,
why don't you start?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then Suhani and then Navroz.
Sounds good. You're confusing your Parsis. Production-linked
No, I said Navroz. You confused the Parsis.
Fair enough. This is a question about PLIs, production-linked incentives. It's still early on, but are you seeing any variation in terms of where you've made investments? Which sectors are you seeing greater returns or more promise versus which sectors are lagging?
We will take other questions as well. Yeah.
I wanted to bring up another sector that maybe we haven't discussed yet, which is AI, and talking about the middle-skilled workers, and globally with a lot of evidence that we have on how AI could actually augment the productivity of middle-skilled workers. We also know from the United States that there has been a loss of jobs, particularly for young workers and those that are lower skilled, so first entering. So India is particularly at a potential threat or an opportunity. I wanted to understand how is the government thinking about converting this into an opportunity, and particularly with the MSMEs, how can we create an AI augmented sort of workforce within the MSMEs?
Exactly the same question.
Okay, so you have
All right, 2 questions from 3. Okay.
Right.
On PLI, Dinsha, I think the answer is, if I were to look at it as let's say a PE or a VC investor, that I chose to invest in 14 areas, and 4 of them have done very well and 2 reasonably well, and the rest 8 haven't taken off, I would take that kind of hit rate any day, success rate any day. So that is what has happened. I think in some sectors, whether it is renewable energy or consumer white goods and electronics, and maybe a little bit in toys, I think these are the areas where it has done quite well. Textiles and some more area where it is kind of okayish. Then other areas we haven't seen the kind of traction we would have liked. But in any case, this is not a program which it involves an upfront fiscal cost. It doesn't. So from the point of view of the kind of response that has come from the industry, I would think it's kind of par for the course, but as you correctly pointed out, they're still early days, because when we announced it in 2020 and then 21, expanded it to 14 areas, and then we went through 2 years of COVID, followed by the initial aftermath of the Ukraine war and the higher energy price, chip shortages, etc. in 2022. So there has been a little bit of time taken, and then we have to account for the fact that global state of uncertainty has also picked up. So all of this will naturally cast a shadow on how much and how quickly the private sector responds. So I would not write it off as yet in terms of its success rate in attracting more domestic manufacturing. Look, on the AI question, just a couple of days ago, came across an NBR paper which looked at 200 years of industrial revolution and transition. And the paper concluded that AI will actually make lower skill, lower wage, male-dominated skills more in demand than before. This is an NBR paper. It just came out maybe a month ago, and I saw it a couple of days ago. So I think right now it is still very early days to see. Ideally, yes, we would love to see AI being a labor augmenting intervention rather than labor displacing. But how it plays out, we first probably have to get the current capital market bubble in AI out of the way. Then we can have a more informed discussion. Because right now what is happening is, in order to justify investors' faith in these companies, the companies are also given to making outlandish predictions about the kind of inroads AI will have. And maybe once the bubble bursts, everybody will talk about it more realistically. And then I read another paper which talks about world model versus local model. So for example, let's say you are used to cooking in your kitchen, you know where the utensils are, how the stove works, and where the spices are kept, etc. And then you go on a vacation, you go into an Airbnb apartment, and that's completely laid out differently. But you're able to adapt very immediately, and that they call it the world model behavior. And then AI, which is trained on a particular set of data, so they put humans and AI apps through this world model and local model situations. In every world model situation, the humans actually ended up doing far better than AI apps. So this particular paper, which is again multiple authors but predominantly MIT led, the conclusion was that adaptability is still a missing thing in AI apps, which sort of paradoxically is a reassuring thing for humans. So we need to look at, from the Indian standpoint, we need to do two things in parallel. One is to equip our youth to be able to participate in the AI world, but also make some of the skills, which is why I think Mr. Baki's presentation will be very important to us, make some of the skills that went out of fashion more fashionable again. And that will be needed also from a growth perspective. So that is where we are. So we wrote a chapter in the economic survey in January, a special chapter on AI, and we will be following it up in the coming survey as well.
Great, fantastic. We're out of time. Please join me in thanking Dr. Anantha Nageswaran for a fantastic discussion.
Thank you. Thanks, Ravi.